Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you for coming all the way to Zurich.
Right?
Have you been here before?
Just to talk to you, Wendy.
Yes, I know. We could have just done this in London or something. Have you been to Zurich before?
I have been to Zurich before.
Okay. To the festival?
Last time, yes,
Okay.
but the last time was a brief visit around Carol, and that was about 2015.
Yes. Okay. I hope. How many people saw Carol? Yay! That might be my favorite of your films, but we'll get on to that. I wanted to start a little bit with just some of your creative history. And you grew up in Los Angeles. Were you the son of a movie mogul, or did you grow up in a creative household? You don't strike me as someone who, was the son of Paramount or something. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I was not. I did not grow up in a entertainment family, but it was my parents were lovers of film and music and the arts. And my grandfather actually was sort of, his tutelage was through Warner Brothers in the 30s and 40s. And he sort of moved up the ranks and became head of set construction, I think it was, by the mid-30s.
How cool.
Mid-late 30s. And a union organizer, and very involved in the Communist Party and the sort of lefty culture of Hollywood at the time, and ultimately left during the Blacklist years. And many of his friends he really felt the pressure and the strain of that changing climate in the studios.
Wow. And your parents, though, didn't work in that.
They did not. No.
Do you think part of that was because your grandfather had gone through this trouble?
No, my mother was interested in fine art when her whole life, and studied art, went to art school when she was in college. And my dad loved music and still loves music and sang in bands in his college years and stuff like that. But no, they were not. I mean, they were a beautiful couple. They could very well have been actors, and they loved being engaged in what was going on in film, but also in art. And my grandparents were a big part of my life, and they exposed me to the fine arts and took me on trips, and they were an amazing. I treasure those years, the years I had with my grandparents.
That's amazing. Do you remember watching films as a boy? And did you go to the cinema a lot? Did you, watch E.T. on TV? I mean, what were you watching back then?
E.T. was a little later for me.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. Film became, from a very, very young age, a point of unbelievable sort of cathartic obsession. And this was true from my very first film, which was Mary Poppins, when I was 3.
Okay.
And I became, apparently, obsessed by the film. And it made me want to draw pictures and perform the songs and replay the scenes and dress my mom up as Mary Poppins and just sort of relive it, And what's so interesting is now kids can see things over and over again on digital and on laptops and computers or video. None of that was possible when I was a kid. But the power of experiencing the film in the theater was so intense, and I think this is true for people from generations before all of these, reproductive the constant
stream.
Access to repeated experiences of film and television. You have vivid memories of these films, and you can replay them in your mind, and they summon tremendous responses and desires and stir things up, and that was definitely true for me creatively.
For me, it was Bambi. I can still triggering.
God.
Yes.
But seriously, that's a masterpiece.
Yes. But do you still love Mary Poppins? Do you watch it once a year? Or?
I don't watch it regularly, but it's an amazing movie. I mean, what's interesting to me is how little kids today can watch Mary Poppins. It's a long film, and they stay engaged. There's some spellbinding fascination with the film, and also I think there was a maternal aspect to Julie Andrews and the character and the Anglophilism of it all, all of that. And it's a fantastic score, and the combination of animation and live action, all those innovations that the film displays.
You had good taste even when you were 3.
It was just the luck of the draw. I think any movies that kids see at those ages have a huge impact.
So your parents took you to the cinema when you were 3?
They took me when I was 3. They
great.
continued to take me to movies that would become the next obsession. And the Romeo and Juliet, the Franco Zeffirelli film that came out in 1968 when I was 7, was completely transformative for me, and I was obsessed with that movie for several years after that. And it would continue with different points of obsession with different movies going ahead.
And when did you start to think that, I mean, obviously I think you're probably a fan of literature and fine art, and we know you're a fan of music, but when did you start to think that film might be a path for you? And in some ways it can combine all 3 of those things and more. Did you ever think about being a painter or a musician?
I was very interested in drawing and painting and acting when I was a kid. And but around my first endeavor as a very young, precocious little filmmaker was my version of Romeo and Juliet when I was 9. That my dad held when I was playing Tybalt on one side of the camera, dressed in my Tybalt costume that I made out of a towel that I painted stripes on. And then I played Mercutio on the other side of the camera, and my dad played Tybalt off camera, and somehow around the camera at the same time. So yeah, it was a.
Did you not play Romeo and Juliet as well?
Yeah, Wendy.
Did your mom pop in or no?
No, I literally tried double exposure once.
Wow.
And this was the night my mom was helping me, and I painted a little Capulet ball backdrop on a butcher paper something on the wall, dressed up as Juliet. Mom was like, "That's cool, whatever."
We're an open-minded household.
We're an open-minded household. We're very permissive, and then dressed up as Romeo. And somewhere, I don't know what happened to this. There's some footage of me at age 9 popping on first as Romeo and then popping on the other side of the screen.
I'm going to call Raj Roy at MoMA and tell him to get this in his archive right now. That's amazing. So by the time you went to Brown University, great liberal arts school in the U.S. for people who don't know it, did they have a film program? Did you study film there at all? Or was that something you were kind of doing on the side of studies?
It's a really interesting question because Brown, and I was continuing to get more serious about filmmaking through high school, and finally mostly went to public schools and went to a private school in my last 4 years of high school in Los Angeles. And it was a school with a lot of artists and entertainers, kids, and it had a very progressive arts heavy emphasis called Oakwood. And in fact, there I was exposed to experimental film. I was exposed to a lot of cool stuff that sort of laid the foundation, I think, for questions about what movies could be beyond just representing reality and entertaining us or whatever. And when I went to Brown, what I learned was that the film program existed. Any kind of production courses were within this program called the semiotics program, which was a highly theory-based program.
Yes, of course.
Within the English department, and their facilities were limited, and it was new at this time to have these kind of cultural studies sort of framework.
Module sort of thing. Yeah,
for the way we looked at and considered film and other forms of art and literature in the context of production of meaning in society and so forth. But I think it was already connecting to things I was feeling or had been exposed to already to some degree. So it didn't, I think for other students it was like, what is all this about, questions about representation, the spectatorship of the female subject, the sort of Hollywood standard practice, conventional Hollywood language that we try to oppose or support in narrative form. But for me and for many of the friends that I sort of gravitated to, including Christine Vachon, I think this, it connected to me and it made sense.
Yeah, it sounds so like you. Not that we're best friends and I don't know you that well, but it sounds like your work, and I can't see you necessarily being happy at a sort of trade school where they're showing you where to point the camera and how to pull the focus here. And, I think you were thinking about film more theoretically than being told how to load this reel of film. I mean, how did you learn that side of things then? How do you learn that?
I mean, I think feminism had made a strong impact in the cultural thinking around the time. It was probably the most recent, it was probably prior to feminist studies in the 1970s, and writers who were starting to look at the classic Hollywood text through the lens of how women are depicted and how sexual difference is depicted in movies. It was more Marxist, Freudian, and linguistic questions that were being asked about the nature of representation and art. And I think the combination of it, and yet this was all before queer studies, like it was sort of after my years in college, that queer studies would start to follow feminism as another way of framing the way we think about how subjects are represented, the way formal and stylistic traditions support the patriarchy or the status quo or conventions of storytelling, right? But I was at this interesting place, and feminism made a great deal of sense to me, and I was drawn to and exposed to in college melodrama and Douglas Sirk, right, who would play a big part in influencing films I would make later on, and ways that these conventions, these genres that came out of Hollywood that were geared toward female audiences.
The women's picture.
The women's film, the weepy, were both, trying to appeal to female desires and expectations in the marketplace, but also exposing contradictions and critiques of the middle class social milieu in ways that some were not necessarily apparent at the time. Sirk was not somebody who was well regarded critically.
No, he wasn't a sort of cult figure like he is now.
He wasn't, and he was a later generation subject of auteurist film appreciation that would start with Ford and Hitchcock and Wells and
then got another boost with Far From Heaven, I think. And
Fassbinder, who really, the new German cinema of the 70s, really started to take seriously. Fassbinder in particular. How the melodrama had a really inherent political, social critique embedded in it, and that he loved that about it, and he found that it was almost more radical to use something that had been recycled and produced by Hollywood middle class sort of film goers and filmmakers than what Godard was doing, who was starting to sort of deconstruct the narrative form and impose a more overt political language into his filmmaking. And I think I was always interested in that, how genre and how narrative traditions were parts of a sort of communal language that we all understood, and that you could intervene in them, in interesting ways. And I think that sort of defined a lot of the filmmaking that I've done.
And it seems natural now that you would then gravitate towards New York. But did you ever think of moving to Paris or going back to Los Angeles? Or did New York sort of seem like the epicenter of what you wanted to explore?
New York, growing up in LA, I never felt satisfied. Even as a kid, it was like, it wasn't the urban experience that I fantasized. And I've since come to appreciate Los Angeles and its very complicated, nuanced, regional, and complexity, but at the time I wanted New York. I wanted the classic urban experience, and most of my friends were moving to New York, and I wanted to be in the city, and so that's where I moved after college, and those were really the formative years of my life creatively as a filmmaker. They occurred in New York. There was a more definitive sort of experimental film culture in New York, but at the same time as interesting things were happening with experimental avant-garde film, where they were beginning, like I was, to consider genre and Hollywood forms and languages, but from an experimental standpoint. Same time, there were filmmakers like David Lynch working as feature filmmakers who were also borrowing from avant-garde, filmmakers and practices, and starting to create this interesting new space that, in independent filmmaking was really at its heyday, or beginning to sort of take off in those years in the city.
I promise I'm not going to go film by film, minute by minute, because we would be here for weeks. But I want to ask about Superstar, because this is a short film that still looms large in the culture, partly because it's very hard to see. I don't know how many people have seen it or tried to find it on YouTube, or I don't know how often it gets taken down, if it gets up on YouTube.
Yeah.
Because it was made with Barbie dolls, if you don't know, and is it Mattel who owns Barbie? And
it was ultimately the music rights.
Oh, the music.
That bid us, that prohibited and had the ultimate control over whether the film could get shown or not.
Okay.
And the film's status today is still one that it cannot be exhibited publicly.
Okay. We can't tell you to illegally go watch it somewhere. I don't even know how hard that is now.
You can find it for sure, as you can most things.
But we won't be projecting it here.
We won't. We won't.
But was that because it was about Karen Carpenter? Was that born out of all this sort of feminist theories that you had been thinking of, and the Barbie doll? My gosh, we could unpick that for days. But do you still remember what was the spark of that?
It was really a question about playing around with this idea of narrative form and the way we identify as audience members in stories. And that I thought, wouldn't it be sort of interesting to try to tell a genre film, in this case the star story genre of the rise and fall of a singer, and follow the conventions very lovingly and carefully, but just not have actors in it, but have dolls in it? Would that generate the same kind of emotional connection that you would have if it was real actors on the screen? Or how much is the work of emotional life when we watch a movie something that we do?
It's projecting.
That we're projecting and investing and filling in the gaps. And so I thought, and Laurie Simmons was a visual artist, and conceptual artist who was working with dolls. There were definitely people around.
That's Lena Dunham's mom, right?
That's Lena Dunham's mom.
And a woman in her own right.
And an artist, a
in her
serious
own right.
artist in her own right. But who was doing interesting things with using dolls and miniatures and all that kind of idea. And so, that was what sort of was the conceptual framework that sort of drove the film. And I wanted to do it. I had a friend who I met at college, my friend Cynthia Schneider. And we were like, let's do some project together that would be kind of a fun adventure. She's not a filmmaker. And I wanted to do something with dolls. She wanted to do something with pets. And then I was in a cafe in New York, and I don't know how much people remember the music of the Carpenters anymore. It was music that I remember when I was like 9, 10 years old. It was very popular, synthetic pop music.
Sort of soft rocky.
It was,
things.
But she had this voice that was deep and resonant, and there was a kind of pain in it, despite the fact that she was an AM hit maker, and she was very young. And I heard a Carpenter song, and Karen Carpenter had recently died of anorexia nervosa. And I hadn't thought about Karen Carpenter or the Carpenters' music in a really long time, and I heard this music, and it was so newly layered with meanings and associations and poignance and contradictions. All of a sudden, that deep voice and that bit of pain registered something really authentic when it felt so synthetic, to most people at the time. And I thought, wow, that would be a really interesting topic. And I told Cynthia about the Carpenters, and she said, okay, dolls.
Can't do that with kittens.
Can't do that with kittens and pups. And Barbie dolls became the obvious sort of conveyor of all of these various, layers of meaning around the woman's body and how one struggles with one's body.
Looking for perfection and what is perfection in physical form. And,
exactly. Yeah. And so that became an experiment that was really my first film that I'd made a college thesis film about Rimbaud, tried to get it shown in New York, but it was really Superstar that started to get written about in the Village Voice and Art Forum. And all of a sudden, in those days, if you got a review in the Village Voice, people listened. And so it became a film people wanted to see.
And it was around this exact time that you and Christine Vachon had met at Brown or knew common friends. And she did not produce Superstar, but has, I think, everything since, right? Christine is here, lurking in the back like a good producer in the shadows. And she deserves her own master session, and we'll make her do that a different year. But why were you and Christine so well matched to work together for all these decades on all these different kinds of films? How do you work together? Do you take an idea to her? Does she say, Todd, no, we can't afford the crane, rewrite this part? Or how is the collaboration working? And I know it's probably different on every film.
The practical questions that you're asking, of course, are different from film to film. And their challenges and their adventures and their dramas and traumas per movie. But I do think our ideas, our ages were sort of fused at a certain time and place. And it had a lot to do with this interesting interplay between commercial and experimental practices of filmmaking, something that we started to coin in our own way as experimental narrative. And this was something that we felt had great potential because we both were interested in the ways form and style could be manipulated and questioned and exposed, I guess, for a viewer. Where you watch a movie and you still have an emotional reaction, but you're forced at some level to think about, why do I feel this way and why am I being carried in this direction? And what does that mean, kind of? And what is it earning the movie and the culture by going this way or not that way? What is the heterosexual closure of this Hollywood classic text mean exactly? What if we inverted that, flipped that around? What if we intervened here and there? So these were things I think we both were interested in, but also saw contemporary examples of in filmmakers around us, both in the experimental world and in commercial filmmaking. And it felt like there was maybe a place for us to insert ourselves. So she saw a cut of Superstar. We were engaged with a friend from Brown in a project called Apparatus Productions that was helping provide grants. It was a nonprofit organization that we started together in New York City. And we helped sort of offer support systems and financial support to filmmakers who we felt were experimenting with narrative in these ways, and emerging filmmakers who wouldn't have a shot at the New York State Council for the Arts grants that took a kind of status to get to. We were kind of an interim place. And it was around that time that I'd made Superstar. She looked at a cut and she said, I'd love to produce your next film. And that's sort of what has been our career. And so she produced my first feature film, Poison. And she's produced all of my films since. And I have this relationship with Christine that I cannot find any parallel to in such a long career that we've shared. That we really, I think we trust each other's instincts in our creatively. We have different opinions and views and ideas and tastes, but there's something that's at the core of what we do and why we do it that drives us forward and provides me, at least, I can only speak for myself, with an incredible sense of support and security and of fortitude. Like she's somebody who will, like my second feature film, Safe, was very different from Poison. This is a film with Julianne Moore. This is a film about illness. This is a film about environmental sickness. It's a film that a lot of people started to watch again during this pandemic.
Yes.
And this was a film that was very hard to get financed. And I would have given up. I just would have...
Because Poison had won at Sundance, and you would think maybe you could get a green light for the next one, but not when it's about a lady getting sick in a cabin.
A lady getting sick. And Poison was associated with the new queer cinema and the sort of activist gay queer culture that we were both a part of, and that was motivating a lot of really interesting filmmaking that Christine was also associated with as a producer on other titles. Safe didn't seem to bear any of those resemblances. And so it was challenging. And we needed $1 million to make it. And it took 2 years to raise that money. And she just didn't ever stop, man. And she hasn't ever stopped since.
It's amazing. Your partnership is just amazing. So, well done, Christine, too. It is rare. But I do promise not to go to every film. So how am I going to do that? Because we're running. We're going through so much. Let's jump.
I go.
Let's talk about music.
Okay.
So, Velvet Goldmine is one of my favorites of yours. I still listen to that soundtrack all the time. It's obviously about the glam rock era, and now you've made Velvet Underground, which is a very different era of Velvet music.
Sort of the prequel, I would say, to Velvet Goldmine.
Sometimes, who was it that said, Frank Zappa said, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And I'm wondering, filming about music, how to capture the sort of magic of music in a film. And can you talk about how you maybe tried to do that in Velvet Goldmine? Of course, it's about more than just those songs. It's about these people. But how can you try to think about music as a starting place for a narrative or documentary film?
I think the starting point is to always remember this is a visual medium. And although it shares the linear experience, the emotional experience of music, it's about, you have to find a visual counterpoint. You have to find a visual language that gets to the core of what that music is about and what that music does. And in the case of these different subjects, the glam rock artists of the 70s, or Bob Dylan in my movie I'm Not There, it was about finding cinematic language and references to genre and references to stylistic. Like, glam rock was about this sort of this crazy theatrical
sort of artifice,
and dressing up into constructing all these characters, these Ziggy Stardusts and these Iggy Pops and these Maxwell, all these crazy fictional characters as conveyors of narrative, but also conveyors of sexual questions about sexuality, even questions about otherworldly planetary associations. And those things, those questions make sense to young people who are figuring themselves out and who feel alien or who feel settled about their sexual life and self. And it gave freedom to experiment with those things and examples to do so. And and yet that wasn't just about Bowie. There was a whole kind of cultural phenomenon that was going on in the New York version and a British version, and they were speaking to each other and using each other to as fortitude and sort of justification for a movement in music. And so the visual language and the stylistic language of Velvet Goldmine had to have that ornate, and I went back to sources like Oscar Wilde and who made sense to this kind of strategy of how to tell that story.
And I hope most people in this room have seen Velvet Underground this week. It's fantastic. And maybe you've been at one of these screenings and heard Todd talk, so we won't dwell on it too much. But, you know, it's a fascinating, to me, marriage of a band I really love, and matching a visual style to the energy of that band and of that era in the New York art world. And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, you could have done a VH1 behind the music, cutting together clips of Lou Reed and stuff, but how did you approach that, especially visually, to tell their story?
I guess I always felt I wanted you to travel through this film and feel the music and the images were leading you, not the words, not the oral histories.
Not the talking heads that we would normally see.
Exactly. Even though we got fantastic, amazing people to tell us the story. And the story is there. It was a balancing act between the visual component, which in this case was this unbelievable cachet of avant-garde cinema that was not just ornamental to the subject of the Velvet Underground. This was the culture from which they emerged, and that was happening all around them, and that they were participating in all of these discreet and overt and literal ways. And so it was like also an opportunity to share that with audiences today. We don't get to see these movies as much, right? And it felt like restoring or kind of an endangered planet, a time and place that was vastly receding. And that felt all the more urgent and sort of passionate a goal during COVID, you know, when it felt like we were so isolated and we were so turned away from each other. And this was a time of tremendous interaction of people.
Collaboration.
So that was the motivation behind the visual sort of strategy.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up. I can't stop myself. I got to talk to you when you were in London a few years ago with Dark Waters, and I thought, I can't believe Todd Haynes has made a sort of whistleblower, conspiracy thriller type film, sort of activist film in that way, and yet it works for me as a conspiracy thriller and a Todd Haynes film. And hearing you talk about that film made me realize again that you don't repeat yourself. You like to hop around in genres, whether that's melodrama or drama, music films. Why do you like to keep challenging yourself? And could there be a fear of repeating yourself? Is this a psychiatrist question?
You mean, is that what motivates the
or why
desire
do you keep
to try different things?
To try different genres, to sort of invert different genres, I guess, like you were saying.
It's more that I feel like I'm learning all the time. You know, like I'm a lover of cinema and cinematic history and history in general, and every story that takes place in a different time and place or different genre makes me have to immerse myself in that and learn about it. And I've always loved this moment of early 70s conspiracy, paranoia cinema, you know, the Alan Pakula films, All the President's Men and Clute and The Parallax View in particular. And the post-Watergate kind of sensibility that was pervading American cinema at the time and creating a tremendous sense of power infiltrating our lives. And the way these films get visualized, the way that paranoia gets turned into architecture and the Gordon Willis cinematography in these movies that you can't separate from the content. You know, it's all part of this sort of coherent, beautifully coherent example of what movies can do, and that really hadn't quite done that before. We'd done film noir, but this was very different and very much post-Watergate cinema, post-assassination, post-Watergate 70s American filmmaking. So yeah, I think it's really just like, and Carol, which people would put into the same category as Far From Heaven, really isn't a melodrama in the Circean tradition. It's really a love story. And I'd never really done
just a classic love story.
Classic love story with all of the sort of obstacles that the lovers feel that sort of drives their inability to basically be together. And this story, the Patricia Highsmith story, really provided a viable way to sort of enliven that genre. And I got to learn and study and watch great love stories and feel like I was applying my own, take on it.
Love that film. Let's have some audience questions. Who's ready to go first? You came here to see Todd. Here we go. And I'm going to repeat your question, just even if you're loud, for the audio recording. Is that a whole sheet of questions?
My God, he has a sheet.
Just one.
Were you worried about working with corporate like Amazon for Wonderstruck and Apple for Velvet Underground, since your career has previously been mostly independent?
Good question. So you're an indie guy. How has it been working with Amazon for Wonderstruck, with Apple for Velvet Underground, and were you worried when you entered those relationships?
Again, each film and each relationship is unique and has its own, like what was happening at Amazon around the time of Wonderstruck was this guy, Roy Price, who was the new head of film and television, and he was given a kind of permission to work with sort of auteur filmmakers and invest some resources in some filmmaking and some filmmakers. And our timing was right with that experience. And it wasn't going to last with Roy for whatever various reasons in that company and its trajectory. And it's sort of figuring out what it was about as a company, because these corporate entities are also changing all the time and redefining themselves in relationship to a changing market. And Apple is a relatively new company that we're working with now, and they made a strong offer on this project 2 years ago at Cannes with a great deal of enthusiasm. They come from music, they come from pop culture. Their materials for the Velvet Underground film, their posters and trailers, and the creative team who do their marketing are among the most exquisite of any marketing team I've worked with in most of my career. But yeah, there's challenges and there's discussions all the time about the fact that we still want to have a theatrical presence for this film. We're just also now facing a pandemic at the same time, so it's created obstacles to that. But it's a good question, and I think it means you always have to be somewhat flexible, open, but eyes open about what your needs are and try to communicate them as clearly as possible. Participant was a company that was a studio that we worked with on Dark Waters. And they had the best motivations for making that film, and they wanted to get it out very quickly. I think in some ways, Christina and I look back and feel like it was rushed out almost too fast, that film might have benefited from a festival release. But they're driven by issues that are about social justice themes in films, and this movie has a real meaning to issues about water safety and PFOAs and all of these things that actually are being seen now in legislation in the United States. So you can argue, yes, the rush made sense, but maybe not for the health of that particular film in the market.
Yes, right here.
Hello.
Hey.
First of all, I really loved Wonderstruck. Thought it was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And my question was, what is your next film? Do you have any some information that you can give us?
Oh, we're gonna make him. So the gentleman in the audience says he loves Wonderstruck, and he wants to know what Todd's doing next. And how much can you reveal, Todd?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about this project that we're trying to get into development, or it's in development that we hope to be in production by beginning of next year, and it's about the singer Peggy Lee, and this is a project that first was brought to me as a question: would I be interested in exploring the life of Peggy Lee? Several years ago, after Reese Witherspoon was in Walk the Line. And the estate of Peggy Lee came to Reese because she talked about Peggy Lee songs in her interviews doing that film, and Reese Witherspoon came to me with it, and so it was something I started to develop actually between Carol and Wonderstruck, and they got put aside because other things move up and other things have a momentum, and I read it again I got back into it during COVID, and I just felt like this was something, again, a musical genre, because it's really about jazz culture in America, mid-century America, and the role of a woman as a performer, and a very, very unique kind of performer who represented a kind of overt sexuality, particularly for her time, almost a Mae West of popular song. But was very complicated, and there was a lot of layers to her life and struggle, I think, to become who she was. So yeah, I'm very excited. Reese is no longer attached to it, and Michelle Williams is my Peggy, and I love Michelle. They're both extraordinary actors, but I've had history with Michelle and know her and think she's just amazing. So
That's
I'm
going to be
excited.
awesome. How will that project invert the sort of biopic of a musician, the music biopic that we think somebody more traditionally minded might do of Peggy Lee?
That's a really interesting question because it employs conventions the way Peggy Lee's music and stage persona did. And through a kind of gauzy, weirdly, jointly artificial, theatrical, and utterly present kind of theatrical, performative style in her stage shows. She's better known to us today in her recordings, but in the research I've done, her engagements in clubs are revered by critics who witnessed her, and something happens with Peggy in the room that is so strange because it feels utterly intimate and honest, and she has that incredible cool about her. But then there's something very performative at the same time. And I think you see that as a kind of dynamic throughout her whole life. Those poles.
Stage and off.
Yeah, playing themselves, sort of fighting themselves out. And a great deal of sadness as well that sort of deepens the songs and the sort of emotional content of the work that she communicates to a live audience. So live performance is sort of how we structure this script to different times and places.
Cool. We can't wait. Here, and then the gentleman up there in the red, so in the hat.
Going off of your mention of Michelle Williams, Kelly Reichardt's one of my favorite filmmakers.
Yes.
So I just wanted to hear about how your friendship and working collaboration with Kelly first started as well.
So yeah, the question is, he loves Kelly Reichardt. We all do. How's your friendship with her, and do you collaborative nature of a friendship like that?
Kelly is one of my closest friends, one of my favorite filmmakers. She's finally, literally lives in Portland, where I moved in 2000 from New York, and where Kelly would come to visit me when I first moved there at the beginning of the 2000, and she was there the very first year I was there, and continued to visit, and met all of these mutual friends of mine who were writers and artists, and she started to find this region of the United States really interesting. And she was still making short films then. She had made her first feature, River of Grass, at the beginning of her career in the early 90s. And then she had taken a break from the feature experience. And then she met up with one of my closest friends from Portland, John Raymond, who is a fiction writer. And they collaborated on that first film, Old Joy. And every single feature that Kelly has made since has been set in the Pacific Northwest or in Portland. And she's explored this region of the United States and not even lived there. So I take some small portion of credit for having brought Kelly to the Pacific Northwest. And I will also say I worked with Michelle Williams on I'm Not There, my Bob Dylan movie. And I said to her when she had written the script for Wendy and Lucy and was thinking about an actress to play the lead role, and I was like, you really should consider Michelle. And the rest is history, in my opinion. And Kelly just completed, I don't know what number feature it is now, but she just completed her latest film that Michelle stars in. And I literally just saw the second cut of it when I left Portland, and John wrote it, and it's a lot of the same collaborators that she's been working with. But she has a whole retrospective coming up at the Pompidou Center in Paris. Oh. She'll be there for 2 weeks, and she's just a remarkable person.
Remarkable friendship, too. Gentleman in the red.
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned the movies that you were obsessed with when you were a child. Does that still happen today? What are the movies today that you respond to the same way you did to Mary Poppins and Romeo and Juliet back then?
Are you dressing up as anybody? No. So the question is, you loved Mary Poppins. You were really inspired by films. What are you inspired by now? Which films do you love that much?
I give myself the assignment of genres of films and filmmakers that are relevant to the films I'm preparing. And so I'm watching a lot of films for the Peggy Lee movie now, and trying to locate the kind of stylistic language through films that I'm seeing. A lot of Vilmos Zsigmond shot films from the early 70s. I just have this look in mind for what it should be, and what's sort of fun is I see it in my head, and I haven't found it exactly in any one movie, which gives me something to do, which gives me something to fulfill. But also Lenny, the film.
Steinbeck's?
No, Lenny.
That's all right.
Fosse, thank you so much. Is just such an exquisite looking movie and beautifully constructed film as well. That film has been an inspiration. I've been watching some the Day of the Locust, Schlesinger's film from the early 70s, is a beautifully shot film as well. And I love Cinderella Liberty is a Vilmos Zsigmond film that's little known, but it has this sort of strange, he is always doing the searching camera, and he's sort of not moving the camera, but he's moving the lens, and he's zooming and racking and sort of telling the entire story of a scene in a single shot, which he does with Altman's films, of course. But that's that's a strange one because he brings so much more subtlety and complexity to what he does in the camera than really the script supports, and it's James Caan and Marsha Mason. But it's an example of how the visual language can really take you somewhere else in the process. So it's not really answering your question, but it's just what I'm swimming in right now for this film.
Do you allow yourself to watch contemporary films
yeah.
just for fun?
I do.
Did you get to watch stuff in Cannes? Or are you just too busy?
No,
You're
God,
back-to-back
no.
interviews.
No, we never. All right, I wish I had time to see film. So there's a lot to catch up on this year in particular.
Question way in the back.
Thank you.
So she's an actress and wondering what makes a great actor, in your opinion. I'm glad you asked this because I wanted to.
Well, it's a hard question to answer succinctly. I think so many different kinds of actors have made huge impressions on cinema and have made movies inconceivable without them at the center of the film, and it's not always because of great training. A lot of it can be instinct. A lot of it can be how they understand their presence in front of the camera. But I will say that, I've worked with some of the most extraordinary actors, and a lot of them I've worked with repeatedly, like Julianne Moore. And there's something about Julianne's understanding of the proximity of camera to subject and how little is necessary to communicate to the lens. And it's something that is almost uncanny to me because I'll watch it be happening in front of me, and I won't always understand how it's registering until I see the film back. And it takes incredible confidence to trust that the smaller gesture and the hidden emotion is actually communicating more strongly to a viewer than something bigger and broader. And that is just something I feel like that's intuitive. You can't learn that. That's something that is innate, And yet she is incredibly knowledgeable, thoughtful. She's not a method actor. She considers herself more of a technical actor. Doesn't particularly like to rehearse. She has her own sort of tastes about how to prepare for a role, but there's something that she protects in the process that's entirely her own, and she doesn't really want, and you have to, every actor is different, and I think that's the main thing any director needs to learn, is they all have their own sort of approach and practice and intuition, and you really have to trust that and give them that room to do what they do. But Julianne is somebody who just continues to teach me what the camera is seeing, and what only the camera is seeing.
Wow. I think we have time for one more. Does anybody have a burning question?
It has to be a burning.
He's got it.
What's the most left-wing political work to date?
So yeah, what?
You're very much you said your dad or your grandfather was in the Communist Party. There were socialists. Was your dad or your grandfather?
My grandfather.
So what is your most left-leaning, most sort of political work?
Of mine?
Yours, yeah.
Yeah. So just asking you, we mentioned your grandfather's politics, and we assume you're left-leaning guy yourself. What would you consider your most left-leaning political work that you've done?
That's an interesting question. I've never really asked that of my body of work, except to say I feel like they all, in various ways, sort of challenge systems of conformity and regulation that we all struggle within in life. And, I think an interesting question, this was something Fassbinder said about movies, is you can't give the audience the revolution. What you can do is show the audience the conditions for which a revolution is necessary. A revolution of the mind, a revolution of the spirit, a revolution in your own life or your own choices. And that when you show it as a spectacle, you've deprived the audience, the individual, of their own ability to make effective change in their own lives. And so that's why he loved the melodrama, because it doesn't solve the problem for you. You leave these people sometimes more crushed by the system than you find them, and they surrender to power. So it's not necessarily about showing how we succeed and giving you the answer. And so when I've made films that are more positive examples of artistic protest, I would say, like in the Bob Dylan movie or in I'm Not There or even in Dark Waters, there's a part of me that always feels like, ooh, with Velvet Goldmine, I felt I have to at least sort of bracket this, what I consider a radical accident in popular culture, this queer popular musical moment, right? By putting it in the past and having it be already lost. So we would have to find it again and make it our own again, ourselves, but that it's not just sitting there waiting for you. That said, the music, the vitality is there. And I do love that soundtrack, and it comes to life for me when I hear it, or when I see images from the movie. I feel the pure erotic pleasure, radical pleasure and possibility of that time and place, So it's a balance, I think, between making things available and making things something you have to figure out for yourself.
I don't want this to end. Can we just stay? Just to ask as we close, you mentioned Christine's Unstoppable. We know this. You're pretty unstoppable as well. I mean, is there a great unmade passion project that you've got in your desk drawer? Are there, what's your future?
Well, I mean, when you put it in those terms, I do, and I don't even know how much. It's just between us. I have to make a film about Freud before I completely retire, because Freud, I just find, and every day that we slip toward authoritarianism and anti-immigrant sensibility and conservative governments and fundamentalist instincts, and that's just one very small part of something that Freud anticipated in the future, because he didn't even live to see World War II and the Nazi atrocity. And but in so many ways, he's a thinker that I go back to, and I think he's gotten a lot of bad, treatment.
Your mother's repressed you. Yes.
Yeah,
the cliche.
Exactly.
It goes further than the cliche.
He does. There's something more radical and intensely observant about Freud's work and thinking than he's often given credit for. So he should be given. And I find the subject matter of Freud to be so inherently cinematic. It's about dreams. It's about desire. It's about sex. It's about childhood. It's all of these things that the cinematic medium is made for. And that the unconscious and cinema were basically invented at the same time. And so it feels like it needs to be a cinematic story.
That sounds amazing. Christine, I'm sure you can just snap your fingers and get that one made. Thank you so much, Todd, for being here, for being
Wendy, thank you
so
so much.
open,
Thank
and
you. Thank you.
thank you for some great questions, and thank you for coming out to the Zurich Film Festival. And good luck with the release of The Velvet Underground. Please tell all your friends to watch it in a cinema if they're allowed. And good luck with Peggy Lee and One Day Freud. And you'll come back and tell us about it.
I can't wait.